Well, we start here tonight. The big story of the day, South Africa's unemployment rate accelerating to 35.3% in the fourth quarter of 2021. The youth, black women and Africans in particular are the worst affected by the increase in unemployment. The big question, however, is whether government policies are doing enough to stem the tide of unemployment. And for that, we are joined by Luvuyo Manyi, the Vice President of the Youth Economic Alliance, and Dr. Bernd Mueller, Employment Policy Specialist at the International Labour Organization. Thank you very much, Luvuyo, for joining us. This is something that we were expecting in terms of numbers. It's something that you also look at as the Youth Economic Alliance. What do you make of these numbers that were released today by SSA?
Well, the truth is, it was not a surprise, right? We've had a horrible 24 months just dealing with the pandemic. Certain industries have been negatively impacted by it. As you saw, the numbers were reflecting on the highest job losses attributed to manufacturing, the construction space. So it really is overwhelmingly really disappointing to see that there isn't any sight of progress in our economy. But we can't be surprised either because, to be quite frank, there's been zero intervention that really are speaking to how we're going to truly recover from it at granular level. And I think from where we're sitting, we are extremely frustrated with the current set of play. We're extremely frustrated with the current posture of government, which really isn't hitting things at ground level to where it truly impacts the jobs that are really required to truly transform this economy.
But government is also, just last week, we were at the investment conference. They are close to reaching that 1.2 trillion rand investment target. You are skeptical about that cascading down to a municipal level where jobs are needed, at SME level, small businesses that actually need jobs. You are quite skeptical.
Look, the quantum, phenomenal. Sounds exciting. I think makes for great headlines. Truth is, we're not talking about quantum here. We're talking about what is the qualitative impact. How is this truly going to transform the value chains of these so-called businesses that are committing these large sums of money? Are they investing it in existing systems, or are they opening up their channels of investment? I mean, are these just plans that have been set up from the many various strategy sessions that they've had for many years? These businesses are not new to South Africa. So, to be quite frank, I'm sure these budgets have been in place for many years. But I think what's very critical here is to understand how does this translate into new SMEs integrating and participating in this spend, whether you're talking about automotive, you're talking about in the mining sector, and certainly the jobs that could be created in the agricultural sector as well. Because ultimately what we want to see is money translating back into SMEs, black businesses, youth-owned businesses, who can then create these new jobs. Because the reality is, R1 billion in the hands of Anglo doesn't really matter. It's not really going to create a new impact into Anglo. However, take that money, put it into a contracting miner. It's going to transform that contracting miner's business and certainly the community in which they operate in. So I think a more holistic and sustainable approach to the spend really needs to be truly articulated. And that really was not coming across at the investment summit last week. So really, for me, it makes for great headlines, but I don't really truly get excited about seeing transformation of our economy by virtue of that spend.
Because that's what we're talking about when we're talking about SMMEs being the job creators. We're talking about how effective the transformative policies and the implementation of those policies are. And when it comes to implementation, we haven't fared well as a government, as a South African government since 1994.
Yeah, so... it gets laughable. Eventually, when you've really participated, one as a student, as a job seeker, and being fortunate enough to participate in a lot of these corporates, and like myself, also now an entrepreneur. I say it's laughable because the truth of the matter is there's still some systematic issues that exist, right? You may have a policy, but the policy is kind of including you in a system that really isn't truly trying to transform how we create. And I keep emphasizing the word transform because I think it's really important we're able to separate the real difference about including you in your business and versus transforming how your business operates to truly now open up the market for new entrants and new participants. And we really haven't been seeing that. In fact, it seems like more recently we've actually been moving backwards. And this is really quite concerning in terms of the state of affairs in the country at the moment. So I'm really quite anxious, actually, as really, are we truly doing enough to curb the negative slide that we're currently facing at the moment?
Let me bring in Dr. Bernd Mueller in Pretoria. He is the employment policy specialist with the International Labour Organization. Thank you very much, Dr. Mueller, for joining us on this particular discussion. The latest figures, I'm sure you have had a look on Stats SA, the latest figures showing both an increase in employment and also a decrease in employment. I think it was 262,000 people who joined the ranks of the employed, while 278,000 actually lost their jobs in the last 3 months of 2021. So the number of inactive people and discouraged work seekers has gone down markedly. In some ways, some positive signs can be drawn from this. Do you draw any positive signs from these numbers?
Thank you so much, Xolani, and yes, and thanks for having me. That's a very interesting question, isn't it? I mean, on the one hand, we talk about the unemployment going up, and then at the same time, the same statistics are showing me that we have 260 or so thousand people more in employment. So how does that stack up? It can be a bit confusing. And I think before we go into that detail, we need to acknowledge this is a very serious situation, and I don't think there's much to sugarcoat here. There's some elements where I can take a little bit of courage from, but it is very serious, especially if we look at the unemployment figures for youth, black women, and so on. But now going on to your question specifically, what we have actually mainly seen is that the change in the statistics for this quarter is a move from, as you said, people who were outside the labor force have actually now started to get back into the labor force. So moving from inactivity to activity, that means they have started looking for a job again. They have started to be available for a job again. And in many ways, I think that's a positive sign that we are really getting out of this COVID phase in many ways, where of course people were completely discouraged. They had too many other issues. They were in lockdown and so on, and that actually forbid them from looking for a job. And so we see that there's a shift, and now in many ways we can actually start talking about the post-COVID phase. And so while the numbers are very high and very concerning, we can now going back to the core issues maybe that we would want to talk about, the structural issues, as the previous contributor has talked about, that where are the jobs in the economy? How can we stimulate the economy to create more jobs, better jobs, and of course we need to bring these unemployment figures down. There's no doubt about it.
Dr. Mueller, let's talk about where South Africa is. We are an emerging economy. We sit in a basket of other emerging economies. How do we compare in terms of our policies that we have with our peers in emerging markets?
Sure. I mean, first of all, I think we need to acknowledge that a lot is being done in South Africa. There's so many different policies, and then if I would start naming them, starting with the presidential employment stimulus and the youth employment tax initiative or incentive, the pathway mentioned, and so on. I could go on for 5 minutes, probably just listing the various initiatives that are happening. The problem is we don't really see the impact of these, and I think part of that is that, if I can say, or my judgment perhaps as an observer a little bit, is that we are sort of lacking, on the one hand, a stringent and coherent strategy that brings all of this together. They seem to be quite fragmented, and I think we need to have a unifying framework for that. And mind you, I know that there are some efforts going on, for example, at the Department of Employment and Labour, where a national employment policy is currently being developed that tries to do some of this coordination. But beyond that, I think the big question, and that was raised before also, is the one on implementation. So if I take the example, for example, of the presidential employment stimulus, a fantastically progressive initiative. I really loved hearing it when it was announced and the ambition of it. But then as it comes to the implementation, out of the 100 billion rand that were promised or foreseen for it, in the first year, I think 12 or 13 billion were only spent, and now we see the budget going even down in further years to 8 to 9 billion annually. So so it would take quite a while to reach the 100 billion that we were hoping for. So while, of course, this is one out of many initiatives, and it can't be the only picture, it gives you an indication that maybe we're not quite as stringent in the implementation as we should be, if I can say that.
Luvuyo, let me bring you back here. There is, of course, something that has to be said about developing a demand-led approach to linking education, which talks about also skills and job creation. What is the Youth Economic Alliance's view when it comes to those two? Because it seems like even our education outcomes are not bringing the outcomes that we need when it comes to having a youth pool that has the skills to actually enter the workplace.
100%. So I think first it would be important to also reflect on the difference between basic education and higher education. Because obviously at basic education level, you're creating the supply pool to enter into your higher education. Now, our basic education system or curricula has just been all over the place. We're not producing enough STEM pupils from basic education. So that's one. Two, now at higher education, this now becomes your job creation skills pool. Now, there seems to be a mismatch between what the education system is producing versus what the market is requiring. And this is why we're now finding, actually we're having a lot of more graduates, but no jobs, right? So that's one. Two, there are certain sectors which are not actually informing or driving this demand. So certain sectors are performing well, and we'll see them in certain metros. So you've got your Gauteng, KZN, and so forth. But certain areas which are still producing great graduates are not actually really the point geographically for job creation. So one, there's a geographic mismatch, but certainly there's also a skills mismatch. And there seems to be a disconnect between what's going on in the private sector from a job creation perspective and what the education system needs to produce. And I think for me that is a very, very critical point. And I mean, this has been labored on not just by ourselves at the Youth Economic Alliance, but many institutions over the various years. And I think it's really becoming important to see how do we integrate these skill sets for these young people for job creation. So in other words, where are we looking as a country? What industries will be these drivers? We've seen a lot of intervention, and I even commend the DTIC when it comes to the BPO space. So they're creating incentives for example, the financial services, the ICT sector, to create jobs on the call center space. And I think this is a good drive. I mean, South Africa has been identified as a great location to invest in BPO centers. The problem, though, comes in where, the incentives are there, but the benefit is the same big, large institutions. I think this, again, becomes a root cause around or a root need for real implementation and transformation. So how are we opening up the gap for new entrants to the market to then provide new jobs for that space? Because there's no point, creating these incentives and still benefiting large businesses. So everything becomes connected, really. So we can't solve the one problem and ignore the other. And I think for me that becomes very, very important for us really to honestly look at to then say, okay, how do we actually truly progress sustainably in this country?